In the fading light of a European summer in 1939, the continent held its breath beneath a sky that still seemed endless and blue. Radios crackled in crowded living rooms from Warsaw to Madrid, voices crackling with declarations of peace even as shadows lengthened across cobblestone streets. The Great War had ended only 21 years earlier, its battlefields still scarred with rusting wire and unmarked graves, yet the world had convinced itself that such horror could never return. Diplomats in tailcoats toasted fragile treaties in gilded halls, while factory whistles echoed through industrial valleys and children chased hoops along riverbanks. It was a time of whispered hopes and unspoken dread, where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the distant rumble of marching boots. No one spoke aloud of the gathering storm, but the air itself felt heavier, charged with the electricity of inevitability. The collapse did not announce itself with trumpets or explosions. It crept in silently, disguised as the ordinary rhythm of daily existence, waiting for the precise moment when the last illusion would shatter forever. The Treaty of Versailles had been signed in the Hall of Mirrors in 1919, its ink still wet when it carved up empires and imposed punishing reparations on a defeated Germany. New borders sliced through ancient lands, leaving millions displaced and resentful, while the League of Nations convened in Geneva with the noble but hollow promise of collective security. Across the Atlantic, America retreated into isolation, its roaring economy masking the fractures beneath. In the cafes of Paris and the beer halls of Munich, conversations turned from reconstruction to revenge. The world after the first global conflict was a fragile mosaic of democracies and dictatorships, held together by diplomatic handshakes and economic promises that no one truly believed. Factories in the Ruhr Valley began to stir once more, producing steel instead of shells, yet the memory of trenches and gas clouds lingered like smoke in the lungs of an entire generation. This was the historical bedrock upon which the next rupture would be built, a foundation cracked from the very beginning, invisible to those who walked upon it every day. Life in the 1920s pulsed with a desperate energy, as if humanity could outrun its nightmares through jazz and motion. In Berlin, cabarets glowed late into the night, dancers spinning under crystal chandeliers while inflation turned wheelbarrows of cash into worthless paper. London's streets hummed with the clatter of double-decker buses and the laughter of office workers rushing home to modest flats. American families gathered around kitchen tables heavy with roast beef and radios broadcasting baseball scores, convinced that prosperity had returned for good. Farmers in the Midwest plowed endless fields of wheat under vast prairie skies, their tractors kicking up dust that would soon choke the horizon. In Tokyo, salarymen bowed before Shinto shrines before boarding crowded trains to offices overlooking the harbor. It was an era of surface normalcy, where mothers mended clothes by lamplight and fathers smoked pipes while reading evening newspapers filled with optimistic headlines. Yet beneath the clink of glasses and the roar of engines, a quiet unease stirred, the kind that makes conversations trail off and eyes glance toward distant borders. The invisible warning signs appeared first in the economic undercurrents, unnoticed by most until they could no longer be ignored. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves across oceans, turning bustling stock exchanges into ghost towns of frantic selling and silent despair. Breadlines snaked through American cities as factories shuttered their doors, their smokestacks cold against winter skies. In Germany, the Weimar Republic staggered under hyperinflation that had already peaked years earlier, now compounded by global depression that left millions unemployed and hungry. Political pamphlets fluttered in the wind on street corners, promising simple solutions to complex wounds. Mussolini's Italy marched in lockstep under black-shirted legions, while Stalin's Soviet Union purged its own in distant gulags. These early tremors were dismissed as temporary setbacks, mere ripples in the grand march of progress. But the collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly in the empty factories and the hollow eyes of men who had fought one war only to face poverty in the peace that followed. Rising tension spread like cracks through ice as extremist voices grew louder in the public squares. Adolf Hitler's speeches echoed through Nuremberg rallies, thousands of uniformed men raising arms in unison beneath swastika banners that fluttered against stormy skies. In Spain, the Civil War became a brutal dress rehearsal, with German and Italian planes diving over Guernica, while volunteers from distant nations bled in the olive groves. Japan's armies marched into Manchuria, their boots crunching over frozen fields as the League of Nations offered only paper protests. Democracies hesitated, their parliaments divided between isolation and confrontation. The scent of coal smoke mixed with the metallic tang of new rifles being issued to young conscripts. Families in Vienna and Prague felt the ground shift beneath them as radio broadcasts grew more strident, yet daily routines continued with stubborn persistence. The instability was no longer invisible, it manifested in the nervous laughter at dinner tables and the hurried footsteps of diplomats carrying sealed envelopes across marble corridors. Key decisions and mistakes compounded like debts that could never be repaid. The Treaty of Versailles had demanded reparations so crushing that they fueled resentment rather than reconciliation, while the policy of appeasement in Britain and France allowed aggressors to test boundaries without consequence. Leaders signed pacts in Munich with trembling hands, believing that one more concession would buy lasting peace. Isolationist America passed neutrality acts, turning its back on the gathering storm across the sea. Colonial powers clung to far-flung empires even as their own cities struggled with unemployment. Pressure mounted from every direction. Economic hardship at home, ideological fervor abroad, and the relentless march of militarization. Tanks rolled through the streets of Rome during parades, their treads grinding against cobblestones while crowds cheered with forced enthusiasm. Each compromise, each delay, each blind eye turned toward rising threats, tightened the noose around the fragile international order. The moment the system began to fail arrived not with a single thunderclap but with a series of calculated breaches that no treaty could contain. Hitler's troops crossed into Austria in the Anschluss of 1938, met not with resistance but with flowers strewn in their path by cheering crowds. Czechoslovakia was carved up at Munich, its Sudetenland handed over like a sacrificial offering. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union stunned the world, a cynical agreement that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence while the ink was still drying. Silence fell over newsrooms as editors debated how to report the unthinkable. In Warsaw, families boarded up windows and whispered about evacuation routes. The diplomatic machinery that had promised collective security ground to a halt, its gears stripped bare by years of denial. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late for the old order to hold. Human consequences unfolded in the intimate spaces where history becomes personal and devastating. Refugees packed trains heading west, their suitcases tied with string and their children clutching rag dolls that smelled of distant homes. Jewish families in Berlin nailed mezuzahs to doorframes one final time before slipping away under cover of night, hearts pounding with the fear of knocks at midnight. In Paris, artists and intellectuals sat in dim cafes discussing exile, while the Eiffel Tower stood sentinel over a city bracing for darkness. Factories shifted from consumer goods to military production, the clang of metal replacing the hum of sewing machines. Mothers taught daughters how to darn socks with extra care, knowing supplies might soon vanish. The fear was palpable in the quiet moments. The creak of floorboards at night, the distant wail of sirens testing emergency procedures, the way conversations hushed whenever a stranger entered the room. Society held together by threads as people clung to routines, even as the world around them unraveled. Social breakdown accelerated as trust eroded and divisions deepened into chasms. Pogroms shattered shop windows in German cities, shards of glass glittering under street lamps, while neighbors averted their eyes. Propaganda blared from loudspeakers in every town square, twisting truth into weaponized narratives that turned citizens against one another. Ration cards appeared in mailboxes, their printed numbers a silent admission that scarcity loomed. In rural villages across Europe, farmers hoarded grain and whispered about impending conscription. Youth movements drilled in uniform, their youthful faces hardened by ideology older than they were. The once vibrant cultural life of cities grew subdued, theaters dimming lights and galleries covering masterpieces for safekeeping. Hunger and uncertainty bred resentment, turning former allies into suspects and friends into informers. The collapse had reached the streets, the homes, the very souls of ordinary people who had believed they could simply endure. Long-term historical impact rippled outward like shockwaves from a cataclysm, yet to fully detonate. The fragile peace of the interwar years gave way to a global conflict that would claim tens of millions of lives and redraw every map on Earth. Empires that had survived the First War crumbled entirely under the Second, birthing new nations from the rubble. The atomic age dawned in the aftermath, forever altering the balance of power and the meaning of total war. International institutions rose from the ashes, flawed yet necessary attempts to prevent future ruptures. The world that emerged in 1945 was unrecognizable from the one that had danced through the 1920s, its optimism replaced by a cautious realism forged in fire. Entire generations bore the scars, passing down stories of empty chairs at dinner tables and cities reduced to skeletal ruins. The rupture reshaped not only borders and economies, but the collective memory of what humanity was capable of when systems failed. Yet even as the old order disintegrated, echoes of its final days lingered in the collective unconscious, a haunting reminder of how quickly stability can dissolve. The world before World War II had been a laboratory of illusions, where economic miracles masked political rot and diplomatic niceties concealed raw ambition. Families who once picnicked in sunlit parks now huddled in shelters listening to the drone of engines overhead. The silence that followed each false assurance of peace grew heavier with every passing month. Historians would later trace the fault lines back to those interwar years, when the warnings were audible but the will to act had faltered. In the end, the collapse was not a singular event but a slow unraveling, thread by thread, until the fabric of civilization tore apart on a scale never before imagined. The lesson remained unspoken yet ever present. Peace is not a destination but a constant, fragile negotiation with forces that never truly sleep.